The episode you are about to listen to was recorded in person in Spokane, Washington, with Claire Davis. Claire has been incredibly influential in my business when it comes to messaging, when it comes to marketing, branding, and getting stories to connect with an audience. In fact, if it wasn't for Claire, the Stories with Traction podcast would not exist. I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. Let's dive in. Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode.
Claire, welcome to the podcast.
This is so fun. I feel like it's a long time coming because we haven't actually been in the same room, for one, and two, we've never recorded live together. So this is a first for me. I know it's a first for you, though you do a lot of speaking live. So how is this feeling a little bit different?
This is great. No, it's interesting because we have done so many podcast episodes together virtually. Mm-hmm. So if I recall, and if I counted right, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60.
Yeah.
So over the course of 2 years, we had a podcast launch every single week. And then there were a couple months that we weren't doing that, but we have had a lot of podcast episodes together. So it's really cool to do this in person.
Yeah, it is.
So let's talk about the storytelling system that we've built over the last few years and what a system means when it comes to storytelling, mm-hmm. and how people listening can utilize it as well. So before we dive in, everyone admits that storytelling is important, right? I've never come across a human being that says storytelling is not important, no one should focus on it, mm-hmm. right? I've never had that, okay? So it doesn't matter what state I'm in, it doesn't matter what group of people I'm speaking to, what side of the political aisle that I'm speaking to, everyone agrees storytelling is extremely important. Mm-hmm. However, most people don't actually build out a system. We recognize mm-hmm. systems are really important, but people don't build out a system for storytelling. Mm-hmm. So let's kind of kick off what we did to build the story system that we have now and kind of leading up to it.
I think the first time that I recognized that intentional storytelling systems were necessary for my business and for my life was when I was a really early business owner, because I started to think, okay, I want to share with more people what I do, but it gets pretty boring if you're talking about resume strategy all the time. So I remember when Clubhouse came out and I convinced you to just jump in a room so that we could get other entrepreneurs to come in the same place and just share what was working. And for those of you who remember us on Clubhouse, we had this room every week. We called it Power Hour. I think it was called the Power Hour Mastermind at first. And what was so neat about it was that people were incredibly willing to come and share their strategy. And so eventually we started hosting guests. And then when we hosted the guests, we quickly realized that there was a very big difference between those who had content that you remembered later, the show flowed, and people got a lot out of it, and those who maybe shared a great strategy, but it didn't stick. And for me, the stickiness was all about storytelling. So that's the first time I recognized that not only is it really important, but we really need to harness these stories and put them somewhere so that we can use them again and really start to make inroads with other people with our strategy by giving them content in a way that actually sticks with them.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning Clubhouse, because there are people listening that are going to say, why even bring that up? I mean, Clubhouse isn't what it used to be from a social network perspective, but we got the reps in. And that's the most incredible part. In order to become masterful, which you are at what you do, it was rep after rep after rep. So there's a lot of repetition that goes into being a masterful storyteller. So before Clubhouse, and I want people to realize this too, for the following that we built built out on LinkedIn, there was a reason for that, right? So we both were doing extensive networking in person. COVID happened, shut the world down, and then we put our time, effort, and abilities into LinkedIn because a lot of our prospects and clients were there. And that was where we got the rep after rep after rep when it came to writing stories. And then you gave me the suggestion of going on Clubhouse. I fought it. I thought it was ridiculous, the most ridiculous idea in the world.
I twisted your arm really hard.
And then we dove into Clubhouse, and then again, rep after rep, and then the natural progression, because we wanted it to be uploaded and people can listen to it again and again. At the time, Clubhouse wasn't offering that. We transitioned to podcasting. And then that's when the Power Hour podcast was born. And then we went from there.
Yeah. Something I remember early on was when we would have guests on, and I started thinking like, okay, they're sharing these incredible strategies with us now in a podcast form, which was so neat. And then after that, we could say, hey, now from this strategy that was shared, here are these key takeaways. But I always wanted examples. So for me, the stories became really important because it was even teaching me how I was going to implement what I was learning, because I'd be able to actually remember it because of the way they would tell it in a storytelling form. So when you talk about a storytelling system, can you kind of share, since this is really your wheelhouse as a storytelling strategist, a story strategist, can you tell us a little bit about, when you are talking to someone who's new to storytelling and you're saying, well, listen, like, yes, you've got stories. One, you need to mine them and find them. And two, you got to put them somewhere so they start to build. So what's your process that you lead people through?
So one of the most important things any organization or individual can do is establish what I call a story bank. Having a story bank. You're literally making deposits into the story bank so you can make withdrawals out. A story bank is not figurative, it is literal. So a story bank is you set up systematic documentation so that once you share a powerful story, you are immediately documenting that story for future use. Okay, so that's when I say storytelling system, that is what I'm referring to. So let's compare it to a traditional bank account. So people make deposits in so they can make withdrawals, and they amass money is the goal of adding to a bank account. The same is true when it comes to a story bank. So I always recommend start now, because it will continue to grow and grow and grow. And then 2 years down the line, you could have hundreds, if not thousands of stories in that story bank that you can use for sales, marketing, staff meetings, that you can continually go back to.
What would you say, if you were to think about sort of the crux or even the beginning really of when this was driven home for you in your life? Like, what was the first story that you remember was a big impact on your childhood? I know I've heard a lot about your grandfather making a huge impact on you. Martin Luther King, obviously, is somebody that you greatly admire as well. But what was the first story you remember that you were like, yep, that's when I knew I'd be a story strategist?
All right, so the first story that I'm thinking about was one that was an absolute disaster for me personally. And I think sometimes pain is a great motivator, and it's something that we very much remember. So for me, I had just landed a job working for a very influential politician, and I was told that this job was going to be data and research focused, that it was going to involve very little human interaction. I was not a people person at that time. I hated being in front of people. I failed my public speaking course in college. I literally got the worst grade I didn't even finish because I gave my first speech. It went horrific. And I remember going to the back of the room and sitting down and saying, I'll take the F. So I hated being in front of people and doing any kind of public speaking, which is kind of funny because that's what I do as a profession today.
Right.
But I was working for this gentleman, and I was involved in a research project for him, and he said to me, hey, I have something to do on such and such a day. There's a group of people that are meeting that want answers in regard to this project. Okay. And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, but I just want you to be aware, the people at this meeting despise the ideas surrounding this. and they hate me as a person, so more than likely death by association, they're going to hate you too.
Oh, no, no pressure.
So choose your words very, very wisely. And it was, as you can imagine, a disaster. I couldn't sleep leading up to the meeting. This meeting took place, and sweaty palms. I was stuttering. I didn't know what to say. And I remember running back to my car, slamming the door and yelling at the top of my lungs, that'll never happen again. I'm going to learn how to connect with people. So that's when I shifted my focus, and this obsession started in me, where it was, how do some people connect and some fall flat? And I recognized everyone had a reoccurring theme. It doesn't matter what leader that you point to that can be vibrant and rah-rah and get people's attention and inspire. It all came down to storytelling. Were they masterful at storytelling? And then I realized all I need to do is study storytelling, and then I'm going to be able to connect with audiences.
So your storytelling really came from studying other people doing great storytelling, and then you picked it apart to figure out, okay, what are the elements here that are at play?
Yeah, so I picked it apart to figure out what they were doing. And then because I was already in the political world and I was working for different politicians and I had those relationships, I was sharing with them different things that they could do. And then that's when I started the speech writing journey. And I'd done political speech writing for over a decade for numerous politicians, basically sharing with them, do this and you will experience this. For me personally, I was going to events and I was testing things before I would recommend it to them. So every single event I could speak at under the sun, whether it was a networking event, whether different organizations allow certain speakers to come in, there were story slams. Story slams take place across the country in different cities. I would go to every single one I possibly could, and I was just testing. Because for me personally, I felt better if I failed, I could figure out what to do so that my clients wouldn't fail.
Yeah.
And then figured out different aspects of storytelling, and then it went on from there.
I love that, because I think so often when we're going to try something new, particularly when it feels scary, and public speaking, as we all know, is like second only to death in the sheer fear that we feel before it for most people. But what I love about that is that you jumped in to try it and get the reps in. And I think that's the best, fastest way to learn. Whereas a lot of people will approach it differently, where they're like, okay, well, let me study this. Let me study let me use a framework already, right? And I know I'm going to be great at it right away. But the reality is, as with anything, I mean, pick a topic. It's all about getting the reps in and failing a little and trying again. And I'm a firm believer in that quote of, you never really lose. You either win or you learn. And that's a huge piece, I think, that came from those early days in Clubhouse and the early transition with the podcast, because I didn't know what I was doing in front of an audio room, much less a camera. And if you honestly had asked me 5 years ago, even if I would have sat in front of a camera and walked you through anything, be it resume strategy or how to bake sourdough bread, I would have said, no, you're absolutely talking about somebody else. But I think what's really cool about your story and about how this system all really developed was we just jumped in and we learned some things along the way and we got the reps in. And now what used to feel very daunting. So in this case, building a story bank like you're talking about, I would think, gosh, like, what stories do I really have? And I would sit at my computer and I'd say, okay, I'm going to write a story right now. And I'll pick something to write about. I'll write about, grit and determination or coming back from a failure or something. And it would take me an hour plus. And I'd be hemming and hawing and really trying to get the meaning out of it. And now it's like a muscle. It's like I can sit down at a computer and say, I'm going to pump out some stories. I'm going to really kind of go back through my experience and think about what somebody needs to hear today, or think about a specific topic. And I'm actually really quickly able to write those stories now, which before it took me forever. But now it's like a muscle. It's like something you practice.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if you're not willing to look silly, it's going to be agonizing for you. Because in order to be creative, you need to look a little silly.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important. It doesn't matter who it is that they recognize that. It could be a C-suite executive needs to recognize if they want to be a masterful storyteller, they need to tap into creativity. And back to your point, if you're writing a story like an email from start to finish, you're going to really struggle. If you tap into the creativity and you have a solid foundation, then you can build around it. So it's almost like a musical artist that is cranking out songs. The songs that you see on an album, it's not that they just wrote 10 songs and that's what you're seeing. They've gone through hundreds of songs and they nixed the ones that weren't the top that they put out. And the same is true with storytelling. People actually, they'll figure out a couple stories and they're like, this is what I did. These are my stories. And then they'll try to connect and it doesn't go anywhere. So you need to build a lot of stories to get to the ones that have the precision and that can actually do what you want it to do.
That makes so much sense. And it reminds me of Lizzo, the artist. Not that I thought I'd bring her up today, but I love her music. And what made me adore her even more was I was listening to an interview after she won some major award. I think it was a Grammy. And she said this album was many years in the making, but also she wrote over 200 songs and ended up with 12.
Wow.
So really, I mean, that speaks to a ton of time, getting in there, feeling silly, creating something, and then just distilling it down to the stuff that really, really connects. So maybe let's talk about it. Like, what did we find after all this time and all these podcasts? What are the things that really, in your opinion, make stories stick and connect with other people? Because there's a difference between great storytelling and great storytelling that you remember.
Sure. So let's talk about the process quick, and then we'll get to what really designates is it a good story or not. Okay. So you just mentioned, 200 songs for her to get 12. And then you also mentioned that public speaking is one of the most prevalent fears that people have, that humans have. So the question that I had when it came to this was, how do you supercharge the ability to get over a fear of public speaking? Okay. There is a way to do it, and people listening are not going to like the answer. You have to go through a tremendous amount of discomfort, and you need to supercharge the discomfort. So when I was early on in my journey, when it came to public speaking, I went out of my way to embarrass myself, because the idea is if you're pulling something and you're stretching something out, you stretch it so hard it doesn't go back to its original state. So how can you embarrass yourself as much and as quickly as possible? Okay, so for me, what that entailed was I would do what we'd consider to be really stupid, right? Like just going and doing stupid things, okay? So as an example, I gave a motivational speech at a comedy club to a room full of drunk people.
Yikes.
It did not go over well. I'm getting booed, I'm getting run off the stage, and it was really embarrassing.
Yeah.
But then when I spoke the following day to a group of business leaders, it was a cakewalk. And I was like, how do I supercharge that? So then I started getting involved in improv comedy. So, I mean, you've known me for years. I'm not the funniest human being in the world. So I really struggled when it came to improv. So I did it for 4 years, and I was in a traveling group where we would go and we'd have sold out crowds. Wow. So I would be in front of, hundreds of people under bright lights. And the way improv works, it's not stand-up comedy where you have stuff prepared and you go through the same, shtick. It is people throwing suggestions at you from the audience and you just rolling with it.
Oh, wow. Like, whose line is it anyway? Style.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But the problem that I had is you really need to be up on pop culture, as much as possible. So if someone asks something and you don't know, you're up there, you're going to look like an idiot. So there were numerous times I looked like a complete fool. But the beauty of it was I recognized this is getting my reps in, because if I'm willing to look stupid here, then when I am giving a business talk, it's going to go much, much easier. So I recommend to everyone listening, if you want to take 5 years to get over your public speaking, then do it how everyone else does it. Agonizingly slow. If you want to supercharge it, figure out how to go and get involved in different clubs, different organizations, and get to the point of being embarrassed as quickly as you can to supercharge that so you can be a better storyteller. Now, to answer your question, how do we know that it's landing? we can kind of test drive our stories when it comes to social media. So we are at a time in human history where we can almost get instant feedback. And that instant feedback, we can recognize, is it really connecting with an audience or is it not? So because everyone listening recognizes that LinkedIn's my social media platform of choice, so I talk about LinkedIn quite often. That's for me. So it could be for whatever someone's using. It could be for any social media platform. But for me personally, LinkedIn actually made me a better storyteller.
Oh, sure. No doubt.
Because I'm putting stuff into the world. Sometimes I think it's a really good story, but it falls flat. And then sometimes I'm sharing a story that I think's good, okay, and it goes mini viral. And like people are commenting like crazy and it really connected. So then I take that and I add it into my talks, or I'll take that and add it into a workshop or a keynote. So I'm using social media as a testing ground to do that.
What I really like about that is that it really opens up the playing field for everybody.
Sure.
So it's no longer, oh my gosh, Matt is a story strategist. Of course he's practicing this art. And of course he's incredible with storytelling. Anybody can do this stuff. And that's what I tell folks who are trying to tell stories for their career, that it's not just the marketing folks who have a great story to tell. In fact, if they take a little bit of time, they can unearth what it is about them that makes them really great. And if they do it in story form, that's where they set themselves apart significantly. But before we go on, I want to dispel the myth right now that Matt ZAUN is very funny. And so let's just keep rolling. But what you said also reminded me of when I was first starting to write content on social media. And I was not a big fan of social media in the least, for a variety of reasons. But then when 2020 rolled around and I was starting my business, I knew it was a necessity that I had to get comfortable with, because that's the only way that I could reach my clients. And my clients are people who are looking for great jobs, but they're not walking around Spokane, they're online. That's where I'm going to meet people who need help with their resume. And so I remember one day I was writing a post and I just couldn't get it right. Like the story for me, it wasn't quite coming across as I wanted it to. And I told myself, write the worst story possible. Just write something and let it be really bad. Let it be not great. Don't have expectations on it and just get it out there. Because the more that I do this, I'm sure that either when I'm laying in bed that night and rethinking it in my mind and saying, oh gosh, I wish I would have changed this or that, or if I'm, like we all should, listening to the feedback from our audience on a social media platform, that's what will help to refine the storytelling. And so, it reminded me a little bit of your story there, because if you just start, getting those reps in are really the way that you can start to refine the strategy in anything, and especially public speaking. Sure. I was listening to Grant Cardone the other day, and I love him. And he was also talking about what are you willing to sacrifice? So when it comes to posting content online, when it comes to interviewing, when it comes to public speaking, that's a lot of really high stakes conversation right there that will really make most people terrified. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just our human interest in survival and keeping ourselves comfortable. But what happens is that old adage of nothing great came out of comfort zones is really true. And Grant talks a lot about, what are you willing to sacrifice? And in this case, sacrifice that comfort so that you can get the reps in, so that you can be uncomfortable on stage, or you can throw out your improv jokes the best you can and see what happens, because otherwise there's really no way to grow.
Sure. So here's something that's really dangerous that I want people to recognize. You mentioned the discomfort. One of the issues that some people have is they can delegate things that make them uncomfortable. So I see this time and time again. Like, we're talking about social media. There's so many people that I've worked with that they think that it's a joke. Why would I be on it? I can have a team of people do that for me. I'm not going to do that. And I always say to them, do you really believe that if Steve Jobs delegated the storytelling aspect of Apple, that the company would be what it is today? There is no way Apple would be the company it is today unless Steve Jobs understood marketing, he understood storytelling, he understood how to get on a stage and connect with people. So I think that leaders that want to be these masterful storytellers, if they're not willing to get those reps in and all they do is delegate, and then they are surprised when they're at a staff meeting and they need to inspire their team and they're not connecting with their team. It's because they don't have the reps in. So it really goes back to what you said about consistency. It's how can we be unbelievably consistent? So if that means just having a post a week and then going to a few times a week and then maybe every day. And then I would encourage people to change the content. So written and then utilize video, all this is empowering you to get as many reps out as possible. Because the people that are listening to this might think like, I'm not going to join an improv comedy group. I'm not going to embarrass myself like that. Okay, well then, are you willing to embarrass yourself in the comfort of your own home, in your PJs, texting out something and then putting it on social media, right? Because I think it's important that people are able to do that. So when people are in person or they are speaking to a group of people they need to influence, they've had those reps.
That's so important. And I think probably where this leads me is to thinking about, all right, we want to be brave. We want to tell stories. We want to try and get those reps in. But there has to be a certain guardrail in place, depending on what your target is. So a lot of times I'll speak with a client who is looking to get into, say, a VP of sales role for a med tech company. And they say, well, hey, I'll just get out there on social media and I'll throw some of my personal stories on there and how I was mistreated by a boss and how I joined this company and it's not what I thought it would be. And then they wonder why down the line, they're maybe getting passed over for an interview, or they're maybe not hearing back from the people that they want to hear back from, or they're experiencing a little bit of backlash based on that story. So if I were to ask you, okay, we're brave now, we want to try as many stories as possible. What are some of the themes you would recommend that are almost like the safe zones for people to use so that they're putting stories out there, but they're also not going to shoot themselves in the foot?
So it's very important to recognize who your audience is. I mean, that's very simplistic, but very true, right? I think a lot of people have heard that, but we need to ask ourselves like the depths of what that audience is. So you and I have talked ad nauseum over the last few years about someone's ICP/C, ideal client persona and/or community. It's really important to dial into what that is. So what generation are they? What family dynamic do they have? Where do they live? I think that's really important. I mean, if I do a lot of my business in the US, I will tell you, speaking in certain states is vastly different, right? Like when I speak in New York City, it's not how I speak down in southern states. It's not how I speak in Chicago. It's not how I speak in Orange County. There's different cultural differences as well. So to answer your question regarding from a posting perspective, if someone's trying to advance their career or get a specific job, they're targeting people. They need to understand what stories land with those people.
It just made me think of this one story. Thinking about stories on a storytelling podcast. So let's talk a little bit about that system. So you have an idea of who the target is. We now are feeling brave enough to post some content. And even in the comfort of our own home, behind a screen, try out some of these stories on for size. So we could just get the content out there. What do you recommend as far as a frequency? Or maybe what do you recommend as far as a framework that people can start to use so that they can keep things consistent and really actually measure how it's going?
So it really depends on what the person's why is. So if the why is to just test, they don't need to worry too much about that. They're just getting reps in, okay? If someone truly wants to be excellent at branding and marketing, different things that you've done over the last few years, that is when we're talking about a massive, robust story bank, okay? To be the top of your game when it comes to marketing, you're talking about tons and tons and tons of stories. When it comes to sales, it's not as many stories, because then you have a sales process and you understand how long that process is, how someone goes from prospect to client. Is that 6 months? Is that a year? Is it over the phone? Is it on a virtual platform? Is it in person? What stories are being shared during that process? There might be 5 to 7 stories that go within a sales process. Those are your hit stories that, when you share that story, the likelihood that you're going to close a sale skyrockets. Those are the stories that you're going to be using. Okay, so it really depends on how someone wants the story to progress and what the why is at the end. Do they want more eyeballs on a screen? Do they want to close more sales? Do they want to get a different job? All these are different whys that someone might have. Okay, but from a simplistic structure perspective, because I think that's what you're asking regarding like the structure.
Yeah.
So it's a question a lot of people ask, and my first response is do not overcomplicate it. Okay, do not overcomplicate it. So one of the things that I actually have a fundamental disagreement saying when it comes to a structure is because I've seen how much stress it causes. Okay, so one of the things that I really have a hard time saying is that stories have a beginning, middle, and end. Okay, which is true, but I think it trips a lot of people up. And it trips a lot of people up because people think they need to write it from start to finish, which is the most agonizing way to write a story.
Yes.
It is the way that you'll want to rip your hair out.
Or a resume for that matter.
Or a resume, yeah. So the way I recommend it from a very simplistic structure perspective is the foundation is the emotion. Okay, so the foundation is the emotion. Now there's 4 main emotions when it comes to storytelling. So it's really important for everyone to recognize it. So based on all the different whys I said, it doesn't matter what your why is, you need to be dialed into these 4 emotions. Okay, they are fear, excitement, anger, and surprise. Okay, those emotions are the most dominant emotions when it comes to not only life, but specifically the business world. Okay, so you start with the emotion and you start building out the story as it pertains to that emotion. Okay, so the way I do this is I just start rattling things off. And this is where the creative aspect comes in. So if I want to pull from my subconscious mind a story, I'm just going to pick fear. I would rattle off everything that comes to my mind when I think of fear. So once I rattle that off and I have 10 different topics out on a sheet of paper, and I see a topic that I recognize would be good to build a story around it, then I go from there. So once you have the topic, then the next question is ordinary world, new reality. What's the ordinary world that you or someone was in? What's the new reality that you're in based on whatever happened? Once you have ordinary world and new reality, the next question is, who is the person I will be heaping praise on in the story? That person cannot be you.
I think this is what catches a lot of people off guard. Because they think, I've got to tell a story where I won the day, or I was the reason that major change occurred. And that can be, but it doesn't come off quite right. So I really like this piece of your strategy.
And this is for everything that you do. It doesn't matter if it is a CEO at a staff meeting, the individual, he or she is presenting at a staff meeting. They're not the hero of their own story, someone else is. So they might be heaping praise on a team member. They might be heaping praise on a customer. If someone's in sales, the default would be the client to be the one that you're heaping praise on. Okay, but even when it comes to career growth, even someone that goes into an interview, there's a way to indirectly do this, because a lot of people that go in for interviews, they think, they need to be the hero, or they need to prove their worth. They want to prove their worth through different examples that they learn from other people, even if they're a manager themselves. They could talk about someone that they learned from, how they made that shift based on that person's recommendation, and what happened because of it. They're gonna show that they're teachable, and they're gonna show that they can really have that change and they can pivot. Also, another thing too is, yes, someone else, but also it could be something else too. Okay, and this is where a lot of people struggle when it comes to what does that mean, someone else. Okay, it could be a principle, it could be a concept, it could be maybe a mistake, it could be a book, it could be a movie, Right now, it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
But you're heaping praise on that specific thing. So like if a company's been in business for, let's say 2 decades, there are certain processes that they've set in motion that maybe their competitors aren't doing. They could speak about the process. Maybe they started doing something and it wasn't working. So they learned over time that this was not a mistake they could make. So they had to put a process in place. They worked the process and then good things came out of it. So they could speak about how the process was superior. So they're heaping praise on the process.
Oh my gosh. The way that you put it is exactly how anybody who, and I know this is left field because I'm thinking about it from a career strategy angle, but this is how people can break through barriers, whether they're facing ageism in a career search, or if they're trying to pivot into a new industry where they don't yet have the experience. Someone asked me the other day, I was driving and talking to a potential client, and he said, okay, Claire, the thing is that I have gotten the brass ring, I've gotten the second, the silver medal, many times. And so what is it about me? I'm starting to think that I'm too old and they're just not going to take a chance on me. And I said, no, I don't think it's that, but I think that we're focusing too much on, is this ageism? And instead, what if we positioned you as the systematic winner? So going back to focusing on that process and system, that's something other people can believe in because they think this gentleman is coming in with a plan. So I really like that piece of your strategy.
Sure. I appreciate you mentioning that. It's really important to recognize that if there is, let's call it a villain, right? So in any good story, you have the hero and you have the villain. Now, when it comes to villain in a business setting, it could be time management, right? It could be not accomplishing something, not getting the sale. So in the example that you just mentioned, if someone does feel that they are facing ageism, that would be the quote unquote villain, not the person.
Right.
But that would be the concept that's the villain in the story. So how do you overcome that through the different strategy that you're mentioning?
Exactly. I think it's really neat from where we started in connecting that stories are so important for growing your business, for making an actual impact on people, but also in your career. Being able to learn how to talk about yourself and how to really convey and articulate who you are as a leader based on the stories you tell from your actual career and your real experiences. And they don't have to be grand. They can be everyday stories about something you learned from someone or something that you're now implementing now in your everyday life. So what's neat about these is that I'm sure you're feeling this as well. We get questions about the nuances of storytelling all the time. So I think what would be really neat is if we can put together some episodes where we just walk through what are some frequently asked questions that we get all the time to sort of demystify these little pieces. Because while it's great to know the what, I know that we would both like to really shine a light on the how. So what do you think about that?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for flying all the way out here to actually do an in-person podcast with me. This is so amazing for us. It's so nice to meet a dear friend that we've been connecting over Zoom for so long, and I'm really looking forward to this next segment.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.